Hi, my name is Katie. This is my first video, so just hang in with me. My first idea for this video was that I thought it would be super cute to do this kind of like best book of my 2019 tag, but then I was thinking about it and I realized that I don't really know what makes a book the best. Like, is it the prose? Is it the characters? Is it the story? Is it the theme? Is it the story? That was until I came across this paper on identity theory that was published in 1991. Hallelujah. I will put the link down in the description. Basically, it was written by someone named Peter J. Burke. This idea of symbolic interactionism. The idea is that our self is made up of a bunch of different identities. We make a new identity to deal with every new social situation. So think about how, like, around your grandma, you might be kind of formal and you don't really swear, but around your friends, you're like, joking around and swearing. That is two different identities that you've created right there. So how do you create these identities? It's because you take in feedback. If you start swearing around your grandma, she would react really negatively and give you negative feedback. So then you would take in that negative feedback and use that to think, oh, I shouldn't swear. Whereas your friends won't have that negative feedback. They will be like kind of positive or totally neutral about it. So an identity, then you get feedback, then you go right back to identity. What our friend Peter J. Burke is doing is that he's actually taking that theory and then he's taking a step further. He's arguing that this feedback loop can actually be interrupted. That's the basis of his theory. It's called Interruption Theory. So there's like a few different ways that this can happen. Maybe you're just like not getting the feedback. If your grandma's like giving you mixed signals, sometimes she's angry, sometimes she's not, then you can't get the proper feedback you need. Or if for some reason you can't tell whether or not your grandma's angry at you, then you also can't get the feedback you need. There's a few other variations. This interruption can result in depression, anxiety, social isolation, and a whole host of other things that you do not want to have. So I thought that this was really interesting. So I ended up going back through the books that I had kind of earmarked as my first picks for. So I started kind of applying it to them. I'll just show you the books right here. Those are a bit backwards, but in every single one of these, I found this one pattern. A character would have unresolved trauma. This unresolved trauma would turn to like this fear. This fear would interrupt their social identity loop, and then that would lead them to social isolation. So this seemed like a pretty good thesis to me. It kind of connected to a theme, the characters, all of that stuff. So then I was thinking maybe how I could figure out what the best book is I could figure out which one proves it best. I ended up locking myself in my room for a weekend with these books. And I did come to a conclusion. So there is one that did do it better than the other ones, which I am not going to reveal right now because that would ruin the surprise. But I will tell you that was because of its narrative point of view. So yes, to reveal which one, we are going to watch them all duke it out in Fight Between Books. First, we're going to start with The Glass Castle. If you haven't read it, it is the autobiography of Jeanette Walls, who rose to prominence in the 1990s as a gossip columnist. So it's the story of her unconventional and often dangerous upbringing. It is written in first person, but Walls' reporter background really shines through, so her personal feelings and reflections rarely end up in the text. One of the most interesting characters in this book is her father, Rex, who definitely has some unresolved trauma about his family. The first time that Jeanette meets her grandparents, she notices that they have no features in common with her father, and her father looks very uncomfortable, scratching at his neck as if he's itchy. So to me, this did read as symbolism of the fact that Rex doesn't feel included in his family. He literally looks like he doesn't fit in, and the first thing that he does when seeing them is to start pulling at himself. It kind of shows that he still doesn't feel comfortable in his skin around them. He has never been able to get rid of these feelings of not fitting in. So to those of you who have already read the book and are going down to the comment section right now to say that there is another part of this book that really shows how helpless and alone he might feel in his family, I would like to remind you that those are just Jeanette's speculations. We never actually see any confirmation in the text, but we get to see firsthand in this part of the story his reactions to his family. This is kind of similar to Holden Caulfield's unresolved trauma in The Catcher in the Rye. Well, one of his unresolved traumas. Basically, if you haven't read The Catcher in the Rye, it's about a angsty teenager who fails out of prep school and then kind of runs around the country until he gets to his hometown of New York trying to find himself. If the glass castle is a pretty objective account, then Catcher in the Rye is the complete opposite. It's very subjective, and everything we read has been filtered through Holden's emotions and biases, and it is what he has chosen to share. There's a scene pretty late in the book when Holden tells his sister Phoebe a story about the prep school that he ran away from. James Castle, who is a nerdy boy who Holden didn't know very well, insulted one of the popular athletes. The popular student got a whole group of friends together and went to James Castle's dorm room. James Castle refused to take back the insult and ended up jumping through the window to evade the bullies. Holden came out to see what the commotion was and found James Holden lying on the ground, wearing a blue turtleneck sweater that Holden had lent him. In Holden's own words, none of the other students would even go near him, and the perpetrators didn't end up going to jail. This blue turtleneck sweater, which Holden actually mentions in the passage more than once, is a symbol of his unexpected connection and empathy to James Castle, which no one else seems to share, which is why they don't go near his body. This also explains why Holden is still so unhappy that the perpetrators were never punished. It kind of seems to him like the authorities don't see James Castle as an actual person who deserves justice. This kind of leaves Holden with this unresolved trauma of this person who he sees as being worth a lot and who he connects to being seen as being worthless by other students and by the authorities. Alright, so to actually get down to choosing which one is better, the criteria is which one shows unresolved trauma better, and the answer is definitely Catcher in the Rye. Holden's viewpoint in this is just so powerful. Even just from this mention of the blue turtleneck sweater, we get an idea of his unresolved trauma, and no one else would be able to understand the importance of this sweater or how it contributes to the trauma except for Holden. The glass castle doesn't have this. All we have is kind of Jeanette's observations, not even necessarily her personal feelings. We aren't able to see the trauma or understand it in the same way. While the trauma shown to us in Catcher in the Rye is very clear and easy to follow, the trauma shown to us in the glass castle is very vague and murky, and you have to try and read in further to understand it or notice it. So in conclusion, the win here does go to the Catcher in the Rye. Alright, so now we are on to the second part of the thesis, which is about fear shown in the books as a result of unresolved trauma. And luckily, or unluckily I guess, there's a lot of fear to go around in these books. So when I was making this thesis and I was reading through these books, I had this feeling that, the unresolved trauma was connected to the fear, but I couldn't quite quantify why. So I ended up going back and doing some more research, and I rediscovered the social mechanism of shunning. If you don't know what shunning is, it's this mechanism that is normally used by group leaders to create group conformity. So the idea is if you don't conform to the group, you will be kicked out of the group. No one in the group will have relationships with you. This works because as humans, we depend on long-lasting relationships. That is a quote from Dr. Bapierre-Tardy. The link to that will also be in the description. So basically, because we depend on this, everyone will either decide to conform or to find another way to stay a part of the group. You see this shunning in the glass castle. But since Rex has been not included in his family, he has basically kind of dealt with this low-level shunning as part of his childhood, and this leads to this fear of getting kicked out of the group. At one point, Jeanette's family loses their home, and Rex's parents offer to let them stay with them indefinitely. Rex refuses this, though, kind of harshly, and his refusal is a little weird. So he says that they'll only stay for a few days. He speaks for the whole group. He keeps using the words like we and our more than he needs to. And it is a weird refusal because it would take so much of the financial burden off of Rex's shoulder. So this is definitely a sign of his fear. He's kind of trying to assert leadership over this group and assert that he is a vital part of this group by speaking for them and by using the we and the our. And also he is trying to stay the sole provider because, if someone takes the financial burden off of his shoulders, then the rest of the family kind of needs him a little bit less. You can kind of see how this unresolved trauma of not being included has led him to be afraid of being unneeded. So in The Catcher in the Rye, Holden's unresolved trauma also transforms into fear. At one point, he is trying to describe what he disliked about Pensy, who's dropped out of school, to his sister Phoebe so much. He tells about this kind of hypothetical situation where a pimply, dopey boy would be locked out of everyone's rooms whenever he tried to enter. So as you can already see, this is kind of an allegory for shunning. So someone who didn't conform to the group standards of what being attractive was then punished by the rest of the group by not being able to have a relationship with them because he has literally been locked out from them. And even though Holden does describe these everyones as mean guys and phonies, he also goes on to describe to Phoebe that he was too yellow not to join their group. This continues the allegory as Holden himself becomes so afraid of being locked out of social relationships that he also decides to conform to the group and give up his individual morality. So Holden's fear of not being part of this group can come off as very strange because there is no evidence that he was ever part of bullying or that he could understand how bad shunning really is. But it does make a bit more sense if you connect it back to his trauma of James Castle dying. The pimply student and James Castle are very similar. They are both described as individuals against a faceless group of others who are, punishing them for not being exactly how the school wants them. They're both in a way seen as worthless. So now Holden's fear of not being part of the group and maybe being seen as worthless makes more sense. So you can really draw this line between his unresolved trauma and his fear of being vulnerable instead of part of the powerful group. So between the two, which one shows fear better? Once again, I have to give that to Catcher in the Rye. And also, once again, because of its first-person narration. The Catcher in the Rye really allows more analysis for emotion, whereas the Glass Castle, there's only the facts. We don't actually get to hear about Rex's body language or Rex's emotion when he gives this refusal. The Catcher in the Rye, just seeing his descriptions of his body language and his tone of voice and his thoughts really make it clear just how agitated and distressed just talking about Pensy makes Holden. So it becomes a lot clearer to kind of see his fear through that and to be able to, recognize the fear and notice the fear and analyze the fear. So the fear is definitely better shown in the Glass Castle than it is. It is definitely better shown in Catcher in the Rye than it is in the Glass Castle. And now we are into our second half of the video. So in this portion, the fears make it very hard for the characters to create their social identity. So first off, we see this in the Glass Castle. So this does show up multiple times for Rex. The most notable time it shows up is when his teenage daughter, Lori, decides that she wants to move to New York, and she starts raising money to do so. So instead of stopping, talking, having a mature conversation with her, or anything else that you might think that he would do, he instead tells her that she's going to become a runaway teenager who will get mugged, become a drug addict, and be forced into prostitution. The rest of the family acts pretty negatively towards him because of this, to the point that he says he wonders why he bothered coming home. I wonder too, sometimes. He's basically taking his daughter's dreams and reframing them into a series of situations where she needs someone strong, like her father, to come and save her. He's unable to adjust to be supportive of someone else's independence, even though the reaction and the feedback he gets from the rest of the family is so absolutely negative. He cannot take the idea that his family will grow independent and no longer need him, because then he will no longer be in the group. So you can definitely see how his fear of being unneeded has led to a social identity of being unsupportive of his daughter. On our other side over here, this also happens to Holden. When Holden finally gets back to his hometown, New York, he has no money left and he has no stable place to stay. He's effectively vulnerable. He ends up having to go to his sister Phoebe, who offers him all the money in her piggy bank. He's very ungrateful. He speaks very harshly, using for the time scandalous expressions like, "for God's sake." Then he begins crying and says he can't help it. One of the most striking things about this is that the syntax entirely changes. It doesn't describe his actions or his thoughts or anything around him. It is only the dialogue and then 2 sentences about him crying. This is very important because it shows us that Holden is literally not thinking. He is so agitated that he is not analyzing his own emotions, and this bleeds into his inability to take feedback. He can't even say how Phoebe reacts to him, really, or pick up on her body language or her tone of voice. He's not able to get the feedback necessary to create a social identity. Obviously, we know that the way that he's acting is kind of against what society thinks. It's against the etiquette for receiving money, but we don't get to see how Phoebe actually reacted. Not to sound redundant right now, but if we are going to compare them for this segment, I do have to say Catcher in the Rye. It really is better because of its narrative point of view. Just the way that the syntax changes and that we get to see him just not thinking about it, and we just get such a peek into his thoughts. But in this book, the syntax does not change. We don't get any special insight into Rex. We don't really get a reason to see why this confrontation is bigger, or how the negative feedback is affecting him or not affecting him. So really, once again, it's just very much clear in this, his inability to adjust to social feedback, whereas in this one it isn't. It's also easier to see why in this one, because it gives us this idea that he's acting so primally and so thoughtlessly. We have now reached the final part of our grunge match, where the interruption to their social identity loop to Burke's prophesized social isolation. Definitely see this in the Glass Castle every time. Eventually, Rex goes so far in his inability to be supportive of others that he actually steals the money that Lori has earmarked for her trip to New York. This causes a confrontation between them, in which he rambles on about how all he has ever wanted to do is keep his family safe, and how they have never treated him with love and respect. Eventually, he ends it by telling her that if Lori really wants to leave, then he will finance her trip out to that cesspool himself. In the entire book, Rex is not a particularly likable character, but this brings it to a next level for me personally. Through the way that he juxtaposes his dreamy rant about how he wishes his family would see him with this very bitter offer of help. He's basically offering Lori an ultimatum, either to play into his social identity or to just leave entirely. She can either be happy with being protected by him, or she can never see him again. There is no healthy middle for him. Obviously, Rex already knows that Lori will choose New York, hence why he stole the money and why he is acting so angrily here, especially during the rant. He has basically found a way to cut her out before she can cut him out. His inability to be supportive of others has led to him isolating himself from his own daughter. Holden's fixed societal identity of being powerful instead of being vulnerable also leads him to isolation. Personally, this is the passage where I began to understand why some people find Holden as being so unlikable. Basically, after being in New York for about a day, Holden decides that he's going to leave again, but sets up a meetup with his sister so that he can return her money. His sister shows up to a meetup with a large case that he recognizes to be his old suitcase. She demands to go with him and take part in his adventures. He refuses and becomes increasingly harsh as he says no. Eventually, he physically grabs the suitcase from her and gets all set to hit her. In total, this is kind of a very, violent and strange part. So Phoebe bringing Holden's old suitcase is basically a symbol of her declaring herself as equal to him. You know, she's bringing her own supplies with her so that if she does go on this adventure, she will have her own stuff. She won't have to depend on Holden for anything. And Holden taking that suitcase, especially so violently, is kind of a symbol of him pushing her back into being vulnerable so that he can be powerful over her again instead of treating her as an equal. He is threatening her to make her conform. This is less intentional. It is definitely also an ultimatum. Either she can conform to what he wants and be vulnerable, or she can walk away and leave behind this power structure that he has created entirely. Just on a side note, this does somewhat remind me of James Castle jumping out the window, but I digress. Phoebe chooses the latter option, leaving instead of allowing Holden to threaten her again. Essentially, his fear of being vulnerable, which was caused by James Castle's death, led him to a social identity of the need to be powerful over others, which did in the end lead him to socially isolate himself. So for our final talk about which one wins here, I am going to go with a shocking one and say that The Catcher in the Rye wins because of its better narrative point of view. Anyways, Holden's prose when he describes this interaction with his sister is just so shockingly kind of violent and very visceral. It drives in the point of his inability to put in this social identity, just how much his narration has changed and how like very unlike himself he sounds in this part. On the other hand, The Glass Castle doesn't really do this because once again it's a very straightforward fact-based recounting of what happened. We don't really get a sense of the emotions or how charged this is or how out of the ordinary this might be. We don't really get to feel how this fear, how this unresolved trauma has gone all the way to creating this social isolation that he finds himself in. The perspective of Catcher in the Rye, through its use of such close first-person narration, really allows us to see the social isolation and its causes so well. So that was our first matchup between Catcher in the Rye and The Glass Castle. I'm sure the end result was a total shocker for everyone watching. Now, I would love to have another part of this where Hamlet and Catcher in the Rye go head to head, but sadly this video is already getting pretty long, so I'll probably make that into a part 2. If you are subscribed, hint hint, you'll be able to see immediately when that gets posted. If you have a different opinion than me, please put it into the comment section below, especially like how sympathetic you think Holden is. That would be a good one. One last final time, thank you, see you next time.